The sun beats down on the red dust of Antananarivo. It's 1857, and a crowd has gathered in the palace courtyard, not by choice, but by royal command. They stand in silence, afraid even to whisper. On the raised platform, 17 people kneel in a line, men, women, even 2 children. Their crime? One of them owned a Bible, the others lived in the same village. Queen Ranavalona I watches from her shaded balcony, fanning herself slowly. She's nearly 70 now, but her eyes remain sharp, calculating. She nods once. The trial begins. An executioner approaches with a wooden bowl. Inside, pieces of chicken skin float in murky water, mixed with scrapings from the Tangena nut, Madagascar's answer to divine justice. If you're innocent, the poison makes you vomit. If you're guilty, you die. Simple, efficient, terrifying. The first man drinks, his hands shake so violently he nearly drops the bowl. The crowd watches, the Queen watches. 5 minutes pass. His face turns grey, foam appears at his mouth. He collapses, convulsing in the dust. Guilty, according to the ancestors. One by one they drink, one by one, most fall. A woman manages to vomit, collapsing but alive, innocent. A boy, perhaps 12, dies in his mother's arms before his turn comes. Fear alone has killed him. By sunset, 14 bodies lie in the courtyard. 3 survivors crawl away, knowing they'll never be the same. This scene, or one exactly like it, played out every single day for 33 years. By the time Queen Ranavalona I died in 1861, between 1 and 2.5 million people had perished under her rule. In a nation of 5 million, that means up to half the population eliminated. Not by war, not by plague, but by the deliberate policies of a single ruler. How does a kingdom destroy itself from within? How does a queen become so feared that European colonial powers who conquered most of Africa wouldn't dare invade her island? And how does a woman who claimed to be saving her nation's soul end up destroying its body? This is the story of Ranavalona I, the Mad Queen of Madagascar. A woman who rose from obscurity to absolute power, who turned tradition into a weapon. Born around 1788 with the name Ramavo, she was a minor noble's daughter in the Merina Kingdom, the highland power that controlled central Madagascar. Her father had backed the right horse, supporting Prince Andrianampoinimarina in his fight for the throne. As reward, when the prince's son Radama came of age, young Ramavo was married to him. She was perhaps 13. He had 11 other wives. For 18 years she was invisible. King Radama I, her husband, was busy transforming Madagascar. He invited British military advisors, French engineers, Christian missionaries. He built a modern army with muskets and cannons. He learned to read and write, encouraging his nobles to do the same. Madagascar was opening to the world. Ramavo watched from the shadows. No children meant no status. No status meant survival required invisibility. But invisibility had advantages. Nobody pays attention to the forgotten wife. She could observe the palace's secret language, which smiles meant danger, which servants were spies, who was plotting against whom. She learned that in the royal palace of Madagascar, the greatest skill wasn't strength or beauty or even intelligence. It was patience. In July 1828, Radama died suddenly at 35. Officially it was illness. Whispers said poison. The kingdom held its breath. Radama had named his nephew Prince Rakatobi as heir. The boy was already wearing European clothes, speaking French, talking about railroads and schools. The old nobles hated him. The priests feared him. And Ramavo? She saw opportunity. That night, the very night of Radama's death, she made her move. 2 key allies, her lover Andrea Mihaja, who commanded the palace guard, and Raini Haro, a powerful noble with his own army. Together they executed a coup so swift, so brutal, that by morning it was already over. Prince Rakatobi woke to find soldiers at his door. His mother, Radama's favourite wife, was already in chains. By noon, both were dead, speared to death, their bodies left unburied as a warning. Anyone who questioned the new order faced the same fate. Ramavo stood before the trembling court and declared herself Queen Ranavalona I. The nobles protested. No woman had ever ruled the Power seized is not power secured. Ranavalona understood this with the clarity of someone who'd watched palace intrigue for 2 decades. Her solution was systematic, calculated, and horrifying in its completeness. She began with the army. Under Radama, soldiers were professionals, paid, trained, dangerous to rulers they didn't like. Ranavalona replaced professional service with the Puana, forced labour that every male owed the crown. But this wasn't traditional corvée work for a few weeks. Men were taken for years, marched hundreds of miles from home, worked literally to death. The construction of her new palace required 20,000 workers. They hauled massive stones up mountain paths without wheels, without machines, just human muscle and rope. When workers collapsed, they were kicked into the foundation pits and built over. A British merchant who witnessed the construction wrote, "The palace rises from a foundation of corpses. You can smell death in the mortar." But the Puana served a darker purpose. With men gone, villages couldn't rebel. Families starved without farmers. Communities collapsed without leaders. The system destroyed resistance before it could form. Brilliant, evil, effective. Next came the Christians. In 1835, she banned Christianity entirely. The missionaries were expelled. Malagasy Christians faced a choice, recant or die. But here's where Ranavalona showed her true genius for terror. She didn't just execute Christians. She made their very existence a crime against the state, against tradition, against the ancestors themselves. The Tangena ordeal became her favourite tool. This traditional trial by poison, once reserved for serious crimes, now applied to everything. Suspected of Christianity? Tangena. Accused of theft? Tangena. Your neighbour doesn't like you? Tangena. The beauty was its religious legitimacy. The Queen wasn't killing anyone. The ancestors' judgment was. The poison trials became public spectacles. Every Friday in the capital, crowds were forced to watch. Vendors sold food. Officials took bets on who would survive. The Queen often attended, watching from her balcony as dozens drank poison and convulsed in the dust below. A French trader witnessed one mass trial in 1840. 50 accused, including entire families. The children drank first. The Queen's mercy, she called it, sparing them from watching their parents die. Most died within minutes. Some took hours, writhing in agony. The survivors, perhaps 5 out of 50, crawled away through the corpses of their families. The Queen retired for lunch. The statistics are staggering. Conservative estimates say 20,000 died annually from Tangena trials alone. Over 33 years, that's more than 650,000 people. But the trials were just one instrument in an orchestra of death. There were the cliff executions at Marinana, where condemned prisoners were hurled from a 150-foot precipice. The lucky ones died on impact. Others survived the fall with shattered bones, left to die slowly or be finished by dogs. There was crucifixion for serious crimes, rebels nailed to posts and left to die of exposure. There was imprisonment in the Queen's Bath, a pit filled with stagnant water where prisoners stood neck deep until they died of hypothermia or disease. But perhaps the most insidious aspect was how terror transformed society. Trust evaporated. Neighbours informed on neighbours for rewards. Children were taught to report their parents' suspicious behaviour. The traditional fihavanana, the complex system of mutual aid that held communities together, shattered. How could you help your neighbour when helping a criminal made you one too? By 1840, Madagascar had become a nation of whispers and watchers, where survival meant invisibility, and invisibility meant slowly disappearing altogether. In caves hidden throughout the highlands, in forest clearings known only to guides who'd memorized unmarked paths, in houses with false walls and secret cellars, the Christians of Madagascar refused to disappear. The persecution that was meant to destroy them had instead forged them into something harder, stronger, more dangerous to the Queen than any army. They developed a language of survival. A red cloth hung to dry meant danger. A specific song hummed while pounding rice was actually a hymn. The Gospel of Mark was divided into 200 pieces, each small enough to swallow if soldiers approached. One woman, known only as Marie, memorized the entire New Testament because owning a Bible meant death for her entire family. The story of Rasalama lit a fire that persecution couldn't extinguish. A young noblewoman, she was among the first arrested after Christianity was banned. Offered freedom if she recanted, she refused. On August 14, 1837, she was marched to the execution ground. The soldiers gave her one last chance. Her response? I cannot deny Christ. He is my sovereign above all earthly queens. She died singing hymns, speared through the heart. Her body was left as a warning. Instead, it became a shrine. The Queen responded with escalating brutality. Christians were sewn into fresh cattle hides and left in the sun, slowly crushed as the leather dried and shrank. They were burned alive in pits. Entire families were executed together, children forced to watch parents die before facing their own deaths. Yet the church grew. Why? Because the Christians' courage in facing death made a profound impression. At every execution, they forgave their killers. They sang, they smiled, they died with a peace that Tangena victims, writhing in poisoned agony, never showed. People began to ask what faith was worth such a death. Secret conversions multiplied. By 1849, the underground church had penetrated even the Queen's inner circle. Several members of her personal guard were discovered to be Christians. These weren't peasants but nobles, men who'd hidden their faith while serving in the palace itself. Their trial became a sensation. The Queen offered them everything: wealth, land, position. If they'd recant, they refused. On March 18, 1849, 14 Christian nobles were thrown from the cliff at Ampamaranana. But first, each was allowed to speak. Their last words, recorded by witnesses, were variations on a theme. I die for Christ. I die free. I die without fear. The crowd, forced to watch, saw nobility in death that made the Queen's power look small and desperate. By 1850, Madagascar was dying, not metaphorically, literally dying. The population had fallen from 5 million to perhaps 3 million. Entire regions were depopulated. Ghost villages dotted the landscape. Rice fields returned to wilderness. Roads disappeared under vegetation because no one remained to maintain them. The Phanompoana had destroyed agriculture. With most men taken for forced labour, harvests failed year after year. Starvation became so common it stopped being remarkable. Mothers fed their children grass soup. Families sold everything: land, homes, even themselves into slavery for a handful of rice. The Queen's response? More conscription, more labour projects, a massive industrial complex at Mantasoa, where workers manufactured weapons in conditions that killed them faster than battle would have. The furnaces required constant charcoal, so entire forests were cut, burned, destroyed. The air turned black with smoke. Workers coughed blood, died at their posts, were replaced within hours. A French engineer who visited Mantasoa described it. This is not a factory but a death camp. The workers are skeletons wrapped in skin. They stand at their posts until they fall, and where they fall, they die. The overseers don't even remove the bodies immediately. They work around them. The smell is indescribable. Yet Mantasoa produced weapons: cannons, muskets, ammunition. Ranavalona was preparing for war. She knew the Europeans would come eventually. When they did, she planned to make Madagascar's conquest so costly, so bloody, that they'd abandon it. If necessary, she would rule over ashes rather than surrender. The social fabric hadn't just torn, it had disintegrated. Traditional celebrations stopped. Who could feast during starvation? Music disappeared. Who could sing under such weight? Even the famous Malagasy oral tradition began to fade as storytellers died without passing on their tales. But numbers don't capture the individual tragedies. A missionary's hidden journal tells of a village where every adult was taken for Phanompoana. The children, left alone, tried to survive. The older ones cared for the younger, until they too were conscripted or died. Finally, only toddlers remained, wandering empty houses, calling for parents who would never return. They were found weeks later by a passing trader. None had survived. The economy collapsed completely. With trade banned and production focused on weapons, basic goods became impossible to find. A needle cost a month's wages, if you could find work, if anyone paid wages anymore. Salt, that most basic preservative, became so rare that people dug up cemetery earth where bodies had decomposed, boiling it to extract the mineral traces. Disease followed starvation like vultures follow dying animals. Malaria, always present, became epidemic as people weakened. Cholera swept through work camps. Tuberculosis spread in the crowded, filthy conditions where workers lived. The Queen's response was to blame the victims. Disease was punishment from the ancestors for insufficient loyalty. Even the ruling class suffered, though not equally. Nobles who displeased the Queen found themselves accused of crimes, facing the Tangena or worse. Wealth became dangerous. Too much attracted royal attention and demands for contributions. Too little suggested disloyalty. The sweet spot for survival was mediocrity, invisibility, the ability to be forgotten. By 1855, Madagascar wasn't a kingdom anymore. It was a vast concentration camp where the guards were also prisoners, where the executioners knew they might be next, where the only certainty was that tomorrow would be worse than today. In this landscape of death stood one figure of hope, Prince Rakoto, Ranavalona's only surviving child. Born in 1829, he'd grown up watching his mother transform from clever politician to destroyer of worlds. Everything she was, he determined to be the opposite. Where Ranavalona was cruel, Rakoto showed compassion. He would appear at execution grounds, not to watch but to comfort the condemned. He couldn't save them, that would mean his own death, but he could ensure they didn't die alone. Where Ranavalona was xenophobic, Rakoto was curious. He secretly met with the few remaining Europeans, learning about the outside world, dreaming of what Madagascar could become. The relationship between mother and son was Shakespeare written in blood. She loved him. He was her only child, her legacy. But she also saw his softness as weakness, his compassion as danger. She tried to harden him, forcing him to watch executions, to preside over Tangena trials, to tour the labour camps where thousands died. She wanted him to understand that ruling meant killing, that mercy was suicide. Instead, each horror strengthened his resolve to be different. He began building a secret network among younger nobles who'd grown up in terror and wanted change. Not rebellion, that was impossible while Ranavalona lived, but preparation for after. He protected who he could. When Christians were condemned, he'd claim them for royal projects, delaying execution, sometimes enabling escape. When villages faced collective punishment, he'd arrive with royal pardons, claiming his mother had reconsidered. He walked a tightrope over an abyss, knowing one misstep meant death, even for him. The Queen knew. Of course she knew. Her spy network was too efficient to miss her own son's activities, but she faced a dilemma. Killing Rakoto would end her dynasty. Keeping him alive meant tolerating his quiet subversion. She chose a third path, trying to break him psychologically. She made him personally oversee the execution of his friends. She forced him to announce death sentences, to hand condemned prisoners the Tangena poison. She wanted him to have blood on his hands, to be complicit, to understand there was no clean way to rule Madagascar. In 1858, Rakoto's closest friend, a young noble named Ranavalona I, was accused of conspiracy. The evidence was fabricated, everyone knew it. The Queen summoned Rakoto. Either he would personally execute his friend, or both would die. The prince stood before the court, sword in hand, his friend kneeling before him. Then he spoke. "I choose death rather than murder." The court gasped. The Queen's face turned purple with rage. For a moment it seemed she would order both killed. Then she laughed, a sound witnesses described as worse than screaming. She commuted the sentence to exile, not from mercy, but to show her son that his gestures were meaningless. She had the power, he had only poses. Yet Rakoto persisted. He became Madagascar's conscience, its hope, its promise that after the darkness, light might come. Foreign powers began seeing him as the future, secretly communicating, promising support when his time came. If his time came, if anything remained to rule. On August 16, 1861, Queen Ranavalona woke with a fever. For 33 years she'd seemed immortal, immune to age, disease or the suffering she caused. Now, at 73, mortality finally caught her. The illness progressed quickly. Within days she was delirious. Palace observers reported she cried out about blood, about voices calling her to judgment. She begged for missionaries she'd expelled, Christians she'd murdered. She demanded Tangena poison, insisting she'd prove her innocence to the ancestors she'd invoked so often. For a week, Madagascar held its breath. The palace sealed. Prince Rakoto waited in an anteroom with his supporters, ready to take power the moment she died. On August 18, 1861, at 10 in the morning, Ranavalona I died in her bed. She'd ruled for 33 years, outlived most of her victims, but not their memory. The reaction revealed everything. No genuine mourning, no grief except from those who'd profited from terror. Instead, an eerie silence, as if the nation couldn't believe the nightmare was really over. Within hours of her death, Rakoto, now King Radama II, sent messengers throughout Madagascar. The terror ends today. The persecutions cease. Madagascar rejoins the world. The transformation was immediate. Prison doors opened, Tangena trials were abolished, forced labour ended. Christians emerged from hiding, singing hymns in the capital streets for the first time in 26 years. Missionaries were invited back. Trade with Europe resumed. But the damage couldn't be undone. Half the population was dead. Entire regions were wastelands. The economy was destroyed. Trust between neighbours, communities, even families was shattered. Madagascar was free, but it was freedom in ruins. Radama II tried to rebuild, but he moved too fast. He signed treaties with France that many saw as surrender. He granted huge commercial concessions to Europeans. Traditionalists who'd suffered under his mother now felt betrayed by the son. On May 12, 1863, less than 2 years after taking power, Radama II was assassinated, strangled with a silk cord to avoid shedding royal blood. His death marked the beginning of the end. Weak queens followed, manipulated by nobles and foreign powers. In 1883, France invaded. The Malagasy fought bravely, but were too weakened to resist. By 1897, Madagascar was a French colony, its monarchy abolished, its last queen exiled. Many Malagasy initially welcomed the French as liberators from their own history. Only later did they realise they'd exchanged one tyranny for another. Today in Madagascar, Ranavalona I remains a riddle wrapped in controversy. Some see her as a nationalist hero who kept Madagascar independent when all Africa was falling to colonialism. They argue Europeans exaggerated her crimes, that she was no worse than Leopold in the Congo or the British in India. She was defending her culture, they say, preserving traditions against foreign corruption. Others see her as proof that tyranny needs no passport, that evil can be homegrown. They point to the empty villages, the broken families, the generational trauma that still echoes. They note that her policies weakened Madagascar so severely that colonization became inevitable. She didn't save Madagascar, she prepared it for conquest. The Tangena poison trials left deep psychological scars. For generations after, Malagasy society struggled with questions of justice, how to determine guilt when the traditional system had been so corrupted. The breakdown of trust, the culture of accusation and fear. Some argue it never fully healed,